So I'm in Nelson and Nadine is in Silverton. So we are in the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, Sinixt, and Silks Okanagan peoples. I don't believe Chief Joe Pierre is here this time, um, so that's great. So thanks for coming back. We're gratified again at the response to this series. It's been really wonderful. And I'm just going to do a little recap of the series later on because we do have a little bit longer today so that we can kind of put the whole picture together at the end. Just one request is that when we're in plenary, which I see most of you are already doing, that we keep the cameras on during the discussions. You don't obviously have to keep your camera on during the presentations, but when we're in discussion, it's nice to see people's faces. So as most of you know by now, this is a series of 3 one-hour sessions building on each other. And if any of you have not been able to see the first 2 workshops, we encourage you to watch the recordings. Our objectives for the series are primarily that this is a learning experience for non-Indigenous people about Indigenous authority. Our second objective is relationship building among us all. And the third objective is to set us all up to work more effectively together. So we have 4 principles that we're working under. This is an innovation space. It's a pilot project that we hope will lead to more in the future, and we're going to talk more about that in a bit. We position dialogue as a lived experience of ethical space. And if we go back to Gwen's webinar at the beginning, we'll remember some of the basics of what ethical space is, a beautiful concept that is evolving. We all have blind spots and assumptions, but together we can help each other see and illuminate them. And we want this to be practical for you in your own domains. So please feel free to share what you've learned and talk about it in your own networks and constituencies. So for outcomes, we'll have a deeper understanding of Indigenous frameworks and reconciliation concepts, a sense of being part of a network of peers that are engaging with these questions, and inspiration, empowerment, and support for taking next steps individually and within your organizations. So a very quick recap. Session 1, we had Gwen Bridge on UNDRIP and DRIPA and the foundations of ethical space, and a conceptual model comparing the roots of Canadian legal frameworks and Indigenous frameworks. In session 2, we had 3 presenters from West Coast Environmental Law's Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water program. And they gave us an overview of their work, which includes researching Indigenous laws, summarizing and drafting legal principles, and helping communities decide how these principles should be applied on the ground. We had the opportunity, we heard a story and considered how story might underpin legal principles. And today for our 3rd session, we're very happy to welcome Lorraine Terbasket, who will present on Indigenous law in the Okanagan. So today we are here for 90 minutes, which is something that we have heard consistently in the feedback calls and surveys. So the agenda is going to be this. Lorraine is going to present for 30 minutes, and then she'll provide a question for us to discuss in 15-minute breakout groups. Then we're going to come back and have 10 minutes in plenary discussion, which we haven't really had up till now. So that'll be interesting. And then Lorraine will wrap us up. So that whole first section will take a little bit more than an hour, 65 minutes. And then we'll move into a second section for 25 minutes, where I'm going to recap some of the feedback that we've heard. And then we'll have a second breakout that will focus on the entire series in terms of what has been useful and where people might want to take things next. And we'll come back to plenary and we'll share and we'll wrap up. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Lorraine Terbasket. Lorraine is a member of the Smilkme Okanagan Nations. She has historical roots within the Lakes region through her grandmother, Swantk, who was named after Kettle Falls from Inchalum in Washington. Lorraine is a MA candidate in leadership and training and has been working in the field of education and education policy for over 30 years. Lorraine spent 14 years working with the Anauken Center, an Indigenous educational institution governed by the chiefs of the Okanagan Nation, in advocating for Indigenous pedagogies within the mainstream and Indigenous education systems. In 2003, Lorraine, with her late sister Janine, developed the concept of Indigenous stories, principles, and Silk's language terms as conceptual models to guide environmental principles, leading to the development of Indigenous environmental laws. Without the tools to frame legal orders from stories, the concept lay dormant until recently when Val Napoleon and her team developed a process to frame orders from Indigenous systems. And we know that RELAW is also supportive of and supported by the Indigenous Law Research Unit at the University of Victoria, where Val Napoleon is as well. So Loren's worldview is informed by her mentor, Dr. Jeanette Armstrong, in her PhD thesis, Constructing Indigeneity, Silk's Okanagan Oral Literature and Chmu-centrism, 2009. Loren currently works with Smilkme elders and knowledge holders and youth to work with story systems to frame out legal principles and laws, and is working on framing a judiciary based on Silk's story systems as a method of problem solving and conflict resolution. She works for the Smilkme people as the lead negotiator for the proposed South Okanagan Smilkme Grassland Park Reserve. So over to you, Loren.
Thank you, Nadine and Candace, and welcome everyone. I just want to thank you all for coming back and joining us. We had some technical difficulties the last time, so we had about 2 or 3 backup plans for today. So thank you for coming back. I guess Waikato Jaisquist Quentindos Milkami. Why Hastis Usap Nasukhalt, but yeah. Good morning. My name is Lauren Trabowski. My social name is Quaint, which means green water woman. And as Dean said, that my grandmother comes from the lakes area. My great grandmother, her name is Swanit, and she was named after the Kettle Falls. And so it's really an honor, I guess, and a privilege to be able to speak to you all today. I think I'll just go right into the presentation because we don't have a lot of time and we've got lots of stories. So just wanted to start our slideshow. So this first slide you'll see is one of our old, our homes. It looks like a teepee, but it has the tule reeds, which is what we used historically. So you'll see in throughout the presentation pictures of folks and pictures that I've interspersed with some of our young people who are working with us and doing a number of photography sessions on the land. So I always like to try to include that baby energy, those young people energy and the ancestral energy. So that's what this first slide is. So just wanted to thank the Yukon-Yellowstone Conservation Initiative, Entering Ethical Space, a series on land-based reconciliation in Kootenai, Columbia. Thank you all. And here's some photographs from some of our young people, our high school folks that are, working to really look at and understand the land. So today's presentation, I'm going to talk about 2 things. I guess the Syilx legal order through Syilx story systems, or Chaptik, and Syilx language terminology. And then maybe framing it a little bit into, well, what does that mean and where does it sit in context of Canadian law, Canadian federal provincial law and the Canadian Constitution, and how do we look at that? How do we think about that? And where do we see Syilx legal order sitting in that context of a settler government that exists and that we live with on our traditional lands? So that's what the presentation will look at. So just getting started, Syilx Smilkme, the Smilkme and the Syilx people are an oral society. We had no historic written language. Our written language just came about in the last 20 years, where we started to document our story systems, our legal orders, our worldview, all of those things. So historically, we're an oral society, and so the question that we have, I guess, is that how do oral societies pass on those systems, those norms of behavior and standards of conduct and law? They pass them on through story systems. So standards of behavior, individual collective good rights established in oral societies, they're embedded in linguistic terminology. They're embedded actually in the language. They're embedded in the story systems. They're embedded in geographic markers, and our protocols as these dynamic systems of right living that give us, that inform right living. And they're imprinted through repetition and through mnemonic device, which I'll talk about. So story interpretation, looking at, we'll talk first about stories, and this is the main topic, although there are other ways that we collectively pull together our societal constructs. And just wanted to also say that our society's knowledge systems, I don't know if people know the archaeological site that they had down in the Tri-Cities area, Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man they did genetic testing on, and he found that he was in Okanagan. So what can we know is that our systems are at least 15,000 years old. And so our knowledge systems, and if you compare that to mainstream Western knowledge systems, we're probably looking at between 5 to 10,000 years. So when we look at our knowledge systems, they're ancient, and early on, you know, we've been taught to believe that that they were inferior systems, but they're ancient and they carry some really important ways of doing things that I think can inform mainstream societies, mainstream educational institutions, not just in educational institutions, but all institutions, if we are able to sort of open our minds and our thinking to look at those things. So one thing about story interpretation, it's a difficult thing when people are not used to it. They're used to thinking about stories like Aesop's fables or Hansel and Gretel or some of those old stories that come from our homelands as these children's fables. And we believe that all societies initially started with these oral societies where knowledge systems are embedded. So one person who really informed and did a lot of work in our story systems was Harry Robinson, whose picture you see here. And in his book, which was compiled, and his stories compiled by Wendy Wickwire and edited by her as well, it says in there in the preamble, he says, take a listen to these. He's talking about the stories. Take a listen to these a few times and think about it. See if you can see something more. It takes time, but then you'll see. And so what he's talking about there is that embedded underlying meaning within those stories. So here is Harry Robinson and Johnny Edward, who are part of our community. So Dr. Jeanette Armstrong speaks about in story interpretation, and she says this in her doctoral thesis 2010. She says, Chaptik are multi-layered in meaning. They serve different levels of audience in the same telling. The Syilx custom of storytelling is cognizant that Chaptik are told to all ages present, and information delivered is accessed depending on the level of knowledge of the listener. Interpretation of a story never takes place in the telling. Interpretation and discussion on the meaning of a Chaptik takes place only when the application of its information is being solicited for a specific purpose. And so one of our knowledge keepers, one of our hereditary chiefs, Robert Edward, he says this, he says, the Chaptik tell us what we ask them. They provide to us what we ask of them. And that's a really simple way of understanding how, at least how to begin to think about story interpretation. So our Chaptik, our story systems are called Chaptik. And in this slide, you'll see two that are in red. So we have a system, historical system of like prophecy or historical recall, but also an understanding of what could happen in our future. So in our 7 generation, we call it a 7 generations prophecy, and it's not something that has been documented. We won't find it in any books, but our people speak about it pretty consistently. So what they say is that the ages of human beings on this earth take place over a number of generations. And so they speak to the idea that things happened in this consequential or sequential order. And so the first era that we call is called the Skistrar, and it basically means the unraveling, something unraveled. And the second era, after all those things were unraveled, what our story systems tell us is it was a water world. And in that water world, there were some things that happened. And the next era that came about after the water world was when the earth was created, the land, and the Chaptik, which was the time of the animal people. And so all of our stories originate in that second era. And so we believe that they have been passed down through our societies, through those generations from that time. And then after the animal people, they came to live in this time of harmony, and they began to live in balance, and they learned how to coexist amongst each other in a right way, I guess a way of right living. So after they came, there's these new beings that were brought forward, and in this the next era is called the era of the still scale, which means the torn from the earth people, the torn from the earth beings. And then the next generation after that was what we call Khatma scale, which means the in front of us beings. And then the scale, which is what we think of ourselves as today, which is broke down linguistically into two terms, skais, which means dream, and Timhula, which means land. And so the word itself means a being that is bound, that is land and dream together. And so the being has this capability of dreaming, not just historically and of the land, but to dream forward, right? To envision something that could come forward in the future. And so it's a really beautiful term for us, and it's what we call ourselves as scale. The next generation after us is termed this automaskil, and in that it's the ones who struggle, the ones who come after and who struggle. And so if we look at ourselves today, we can think about ourselves as these beings who have not quite learned how to live in a balanced, harmonious way with the natural world. And so we're struggling. And so we see that today I mean, you look at the sicknesses, you look at the, global warming, you look at the issues that we see related to land and conservation and sustainability. And so it means the ones who struggle. And then the last era that we understand to coming is this era called Kwasich, and it's the unknown. And sometimes our people talk about it and think about it as the unknowing, right? Somehow the people have forgotten that they are Tamich, that they are part of the land and the natural landscape, and they've forgotten who they are. So they don't know anymore. And so just wanted to speak to the idea of the Chaptiquan. That's where our story systems come from, which was the era before human beings. So Chaptik we call them Chaptik. Its translation means these embers of something that were passed forward to us from that time. And Chaptik are basically, you could think of them as stories. They can be understood as a mnemonic device, a device like if you think about, I'm going to remember that I have to get coffee from the store, so I'll tie a string around my finger. Or I used to be, I needed to remember to drop off videos at the gas station, so I would remember, as soon as I see a yellow blinking light, I have to drop off a video. So it's a memory jarring device. So Chaptik can be understood as being that. The topics are important, as are the details of the telling of a Chaptik story. So we use things like inflection, right? We emphasize certain things. We use movements. We use humor. We use shock factor in our story system. So they were really almost ingeniously designed. And our storytellers have been these amazing people that really understood how to instill in our people the memory of these stories and that underlying thinking that surrounds those stories. So Sinkalip Chaptik, or Sinkalip means coyote. So Sinkalip stories are usually extremely humorous. They're really funny. Sinkalip is kind of our trickster, and he does a whole bunch of things that he shouldn't do, and a lot of things he's been charged to do that are really important. So he's really funny on one hand, and at the same time, what he does and how he is really disturbing on another. The images of his follies are so over dramatized that it's clear that they're constructed to stick in the memory in the same mnemonic way as geographic markers. And that's sort of what Dr. Armstrong is talking about. And for instance, Coyote burnt his children alive. And so we think about that story, and it sort of, it really jars your sense of morality and rightness and you can't even think that someone who would do that, but Coyote did do that. And so he is this character that has these extremes of duality, of goodness and badness. And so our stories, when they're told, our people understand that when they're in the telling. So I'm going to talk about a couple of stories. So one of the most important stories in our knowledge systems is the Earth Diver story. And during that time, the world was made of water. It was a water world, and we have 7 worlds in our universal constructs. And the world was a water world, and Coyote was brought forward by the creator, and he was given a job. He made this little piece of it was actually like a lily pad, and they sat on top of that, and he asked Coyote to dive for Earth. And so Coyote dove, and he every time he dove, his successive dives, he was able to get a little further. The third dive, he was finally able to scrape up dirt and earth off the sand off the ocean floor. And when he came up, right, he was sputtering and stammering for breath and choking and spitting out water. And he looked in his little paws and he didn't see anything. And so he had one more attempt in that he was allowed to dive for Earth. So he dove that 4th time. And the same thing, he was able to touch the bottom and to scoop up a little paw full of earth. But as he swam, the sand just sort of melted away, like how it does when we try to pull sand up from the bottom of the lakes. So he got to the top, and the creator said he was in despair. He's sad, and he was really sad and really despairing because he was not able to complete the work that was given by the creator. And so the creator called him over, and he took his little paw under his, and he looked at it, and he pulled from under his nails these 4 grains of sand. And the 4 grains of sand were used to create the land, the colors of the land. And they were also used to create these 4 brothers. And the brothers were each created in turn, the white brother, the yellow, or the black brother, the yellow brother, the red brother, the white brother. And the creator gave them the directive, all of them. He called them together and said, I'm going to send you away for a time. And when you come back, your work is to learn from the land. And so I'll call you back after a time, and we'll talk about what you've learned. So each of the brothers left, and of course the littlest brother, the youngest, was the white brother. And because he was the baby, he didn't go and learn from the land. He just kind of played, and he ran around, and he did his thing. He swam, and he did all the things that little babies do. And so when the creator brought them all back together after a time, he asked each of them. He sat on this log, and he had this book and this writing, and he asked each of them what they had learned. So they talked, right? They talked for these days of what they learned. And so we came to the youngest white brother, and he asked, what have you learned? And of course, the little brother, he didn't learn anything. He played all the whole time. And so he saw that the creator had a book. So he kind of inched over there, and he put the book under his arm. And because he thought, that he could fool them into believing that he had learned, and that he would go away later and learn from this book that belonged to the creator. So the creator, kind of listened, and he says, well, what have you learned? And the littlest brother said, I learned all the things that my brothers have learned. I learned about the water, and I learned about the plants. And he just basically reiterated everything that his brothers had talked about. So the creator knew, and they all knew that he hadn't learned. So the creator looked at him, and, because he was a baby, he says, well, because you didn't go and didn't do what was told, he says, we're not going to you were not going to be punished for that. He says, and because you took the book, he says, I'll let you keep the book. And he says, you go over there and you jump over that log, and over on the other side of that log, there's this water. And he says, jump over that and go, and he sent him on an errand. So he jumped over the water, and then he made this big water that came between him and his brothers. And he said, you're going to take that book, and you're going to, then he gave each of the brothers their land. He sent them on their way and said, this is your land, and this is your land, and this is your land. And he said to the indigenous people, this is your land. And so he said, one day you'll come back together, and if you will come back together to share everything that you've learned, and you'll come together and you'll be this great people. And he said, when the little brother comes back, we'll know whether he has learned by the symbol he brings forward. And so when the little brother brought his symbol forward, when they landed on our continent in North America, when he first came forward, he brought the wrong symbol. And so the creator said, if he brings the wrong symbol, then your work is to teach him. So that story is a really important story because it does a couple of things. It lays out the foundation of title for Indigenous people, that this land was created by the creator and given to us. So it lays out that foundation of that connection to place. But it does a couple of other things. It tells us some really important directive to, number one, to go, that everything that we need to know, that all of the learning that is possible can be learnt from the land, can be learnt from the natural world. And so that is the basis, and it has to be the basis of our learning and our knowledge systems. And it also tells us that our combined knowledge systems, that our work, our relationship with our other people, other generations, or other nations will come together. And when we can learn how to pull that knowledge together, that it'll be good. So the little brother, of course, he brought the wrong symbols. So the creator said, if he brings a circle home, he'll have learned, he'll have gained the wisdom of that book. But if he brings a cross symbol, that he will have gone wrong in his learning. He'll have gone wrong. And so, of course, he brought the wrong symbol. So that is a really important story for us, in that it speaks to our land and title. It speaks to learning from the land. It teaches us how to interact with our brothers, that we are to come together and to work cooperatively and collaboratively with our brothers. And also that it teaches us to help one another. And that was our directive with our younger brother when he came back, which is one of the reasons that we never warred with the settler populations when they came forward, that our people recollected that story. So another important story is for foods, and it's the basis, our basis for environmental conservation. So when we look at for foods, basically the animal people existed on the earth before humans. So if you look at Coyote, he brought forward these beings. But the animal people in our story systems existed, and they were brought forward, and they were created, and they learned how to live. And there were these great tribes of animal people, the four-leggeds that walked on the earth. And there were the ones that were in the air, like the winged ones, but also the berries, which exist above the earth. And then there was the beings, the insects, and the beings that lived underneath the earth, that there had roots, and there were insects, and there was moles. So it wasn't a specific type of being. It was just a tribe that existed in that place. And then there were the tribes that existed in the water, and they included like the fish and like octopus and crabs and all the insects that live under there, the planktons. So each of the four, there were these great tribes that existed, the water tribes and the air tribes and the under the earth tribes and the walking on land tribes. And they dreamt this new people that were to come. And this new people, when they were shown these new people, they said, this new people is going to be here, and they're made up of all of you, but they're just pitiful. They don't have hair, and they can't run very fast, and they're born stupid. They don't quite know how to learn. Like they sort of learn over time, but if we left them to their own devices, they're going to die. And so the animal people came together in this place we call like the Colosseum over near Inchulin. And they talked for ages. What can we do for this new people? They're so pitiful, and they're these beings that are just, they don't know anything, and they're down, they're ugly. And so they talked amongst themselves, and they couldn't find a way to help the new beings. So the oldest of the tribes of the chiefs was Kamhist. He was the oldest brother of the beings that walked on the land, but he was also the oldest of the chiefs that were present. And so he was given they all in turn, like, I don't know what to do. They talked about it for a long time. And finally, he said, they told him, you're the eldest, so you tell us what to do and we'll do that. And so he thought about it. He's like, oh, I don't know what to do. I've been thinking about it. My people have been talking about it. So he says, I will give the new people myself. That's all I have to give. And so he says, I give my body as food for the new people. And so each of the tribes and each of his tribe members gave themselves. And then the water people gave of themselves, and the under the earth people and the flying ones. They all gave themselves as food, as resources, as medicine, as all of the things that were needed by the new people. And so he laid his life down after that. And he said, in order to bring this into law, to covenant, that he would lay his life down, and they were to sing their songs. And so they were to sing their songs and to bring him back to life. And so each of the animal people sang their songs. And I think about it when I think about it for myself, like these songs of creation, these beautiful, beautiful songs. Each of them sang their songs, but none of them could bring Skamhist or Black Bear back to life. And so there was this other being that was flying around. It was and it was Fly. And so Fly was kind of flying around there, and he wanted to sing his song. And the people, the animal people, like, get out of here. They didn't want him there. He was this lowliest of beings. And they said to him, leave us alone. Like, no, this is important work that we're doing. And they said, you're just a shit eater. You exist on shit, and you go back to where you come from. So they really were unkind to him. And so as each of the animal people sang, and Skamhist was not able to come back to life, to be brought back, they went into despair. They were so sad that they were not able to help in any way. And so as the last one sang their songs and Skamhist never got up, finally they looked at Fly and were like, well, it can't hurt to let him sing his song. And so Fly was allowed to sing his song, and it was Fly's song that brought Bear back. He stood up from his sleep, and Fly brought him back to life. And we don't know in that story whether it was the combination of all of the songs of creation that were able to bring the law to the new people, or if it was his song that was that powerful because he was such a humble, simple being. But the story is important in a number of ways. So as Fly was brought back to life, the creator looked at the people and he said, okay, the new people to be will have food and medicine and clothing and shelter, and they'll be given that. And Black Bear said, there'll be two things that I require. Number one is that they continue to use us, to utilize us. And number two, that they continue to sing the songs and to do the ceremonies of creation. So this story is a really important story for us because it defines our relationship to the natural world. So in comparison, if we look at, there's one story that the people tell, and it's the story of Christianity, where God made the heaven and the earth and Adam and Eve, and then they talk to the snake, and right. But in that story, the creator gave dominion. He gave Adam and Eve in that story dominion over the earth. And in the story of science, right? Oh, there was something that was black and everything exploded, and then everything sort of evolved over time to these great beings, which is us with the big brains, right? And so we think of ourselves in the story of science as these greatly evolved beings with big brains that manipulate our environment, right? So we use the criteria for evolution and the right to do what we want to the natural world as our big brain. And so both of them really have a strong, dominant, related relationship, dominion over the natural world. But our story is one of being being grateful, and that the natural world, through its generosity and through its good feeling and good thinking, and its what's the word I'm looking for? Generosity, for lack of a better word, that we define our relationship as one of coexistence, and that we are beholden to the natural world for our lives. And so it's a different relationship that was established for us and within our story systems. So number one, it establishes our relationship, but it also in that story passes down two really important laws. And they seem simple, but they're not. So one of the rules or laws that came down from Black Bear was that the people have to continue to use us. And so what does that mean? It means underlying that idea is that they have to be here. So the law of sustainability comes out of that directive for us, that they continue to be here. And number two, that we continue to sing the songs and to do the ceremonies of renewal. And it creates this relationship that is very much about reverence, that our people have this really reverential relationship with the natural world, and that our work is renewal and restoration. So it gives us some very clear rules about our existence on this earth, and they told us what we needed to do. So our law is ceremony, that we have to undertake those ceremonies that were handed down, and to continue to sing those songs. And it's that idea of establishing a relationship that is based on both sustainability and reverence for the natural world. So there's some other things. I'm not going to talk about the story because we're getting short on time, but it speaks to the idea of that spiritual connection in terms of our law and our right living, and I'm not going to talk about that. This is an important story only in that this is Fox and Coyote, that Fox and Coyote were twins in our story systems, and Fox's work, Coyote got into all kinds of trouble and he got ripped to pieces and he got, rotted and whatever, died. Fox's work was always to bring him back and to restore him. So from that story system, we speak to the idea of restoration and creating that if we even have the smallest embers of something, remnants of something, that we can restore it. And that the restoration, the law of restoration comes out of that story. So looking at, we also have other parts of our systems that speak to law, and this is one of the most important one. The picture on your right, it's one of our pillar rocks. And so when Coyote came through the land, he gave us these reminders. And so you notice there on the pillar there's these rocks. And so Coyote said to the people that your work is to care for the land, is to work in this good way, and to learn how to live in a good way on the land, and to obey the laws that were given. And he said, when the people begin to break the laws, he said, you'll know that your people will be in peril, because these rocks will fall from those pillars. They'll fall from those high places. So our people are very careful about those pillar rocks, and we're careful about protecting them as monuments, because he let us know that those rocks would fall from those pillars when the people had gone wrong, when they had gone down in a road that was not okay. And I don't have time to talk about Enloe Dam. So if we look at our, those are laws, right? The law that was passed down, that our people would continue to be here as long as we lived in this way with the natural world, and that our people would be no more if we break the law. They're really simple constructs. And as the people hear those stories again and again, what they learn how to do is live in this really balanced, I guess, for lack of a better word, way with the natural world, from an attitude of gratitude and right living on the land. It's a gentle relationship that we have. And so we understand that when our people start to look at the land as a thing, when we begin to objectify it or look at it as a currency or an object or a thing that is only there as a resource for that we say it puhikik, it means the people's thinking has gone wrong. And so it's understood that those things would give themselves to us, but when we started to hoard them and to utilize them and to overharvest them and to extinction, we know that the laws are being broken. And so our people are very cognizant of that. And so they're when our people stand up on the road and they protest and they're angry, it's that we have a responsibility to the land, and we take that very seriously, because we know that the people, they're a really fragile being, the human beings, and that there'll be no more if we're not careful about how we interact, because the natural world is so powerful. So going back, well, what is this? How do we show the law? How do we tell the law? What is our process for infraction of the law? And so those systems exist within our stories. So we've got thousands of stories. But the basic or general construct that we can look at in terms of the process of passing on the knowledge of the law so that the people adhere to the law, and then the process for breaking the law. So the first word that we can look at is Gulst, and it means the understanding of infraction and consequence. So it's basically cause-effect relationship. If you do this, this is what happens. So before, our people would gather our hatus, the eldest in our families, our suquinamam, which is our good men or good women or councilwomen, and they would bring together the people and say, we're kind of going wrong in the way that we're doing things, or they'd call a family or they'd call a person and they'd say, this is what you're doing, and this is the consequence of what you're doing. And it's informative rather than punitive. So they will, their job is not the consequence or doling out judgment is not their place. It's only to remind the people of the law, and so that the people learn how to move back into right living. And so if that doesn't work as a process where they bring them and say, this is the infraction and the consequence, it's up to the person if they're going to follow that law. It's up to the people, the human beings or the groups. Are you going to change your behavior? We can't make you. Human beings were born free. So our work is just to help inform. That's our job. The next one process, or a more deeper process, is Gashachkin, and it means looking under the obvious. So looking at a problem that we're seeing in terms of either it can be social or it can be environmental. What is underneath that problem, right? An analysis of a problem and an infraction, and to help to find a way to change that and to bring it back into right living, into proper living. And that was done through our chief systems. We have a really extreme hierarchy in terms of, not hierarchy, extreme complicated system of people that will come into our lives to help to inform us in terms of right living. So in terms of process, dispute, infraction, or procedure, our first step is Nalkandam, which means the circle discussion process to solve a problem or a dispute or an infraction, and it relies on the presence of right insight or information. So we bring our good men and our good women, our wise ones, and I guess it would not be unlike judges in a legal system today, and they would come together and they would talk about a problem or a thing, and to work with a person or a group of people to say, how do we move the men back into right living, and how do we right a wrong that has been created? The next process for us is called Naukanwich, and it comes out of that 4-food story, and it's more of a ceremonial process. So the first one is basically a discussion, and it's sort of higher level. But Naukanwich as a process calls the ancients. So we're calling our ancestors, and so it's a spiritual process for us of calling them forward and asking for their help or their direction. And so when we call them, we are doing it we're careful about calling the ancient ones, because they come forward. We believe that they come forward and they help us to resolve an issue. And so it is ceremonial, and the outcome is a decree. It's a spiritual decree. And if we don't follow that, if the people who agree to it don't follow it, that the karma, I guess, if you will, is on them. And in our Coyote and Wolf story, the karma of not adhering to spiritual decree in our societies is death. And it's not our job to dole that out. That's spiritual law for us. And so what we can see is that our people have these successive ways of helping to teach one another, and that understanding that if a person doesn't follow the law, that they're pitiful, and we don't know, there's nothing else we can do. We do everything we can to help them to live the right way. But when we call in the ancients, that spiritual decree, and so they're at their own devices to, if they're going to continue to go down the road that they've gone. So there's an important word, tishishnunt, and it means to straighten something, to make it right. And the imperative of a person or a group who are responsible for an infraction, how can that be resolved or made right? And so our process in terms of a general communal type judiciary is to ask that question. And our process related to the natural world is, how do we make it right? And we don't necessarily look at fault. We look at, how do we right something? Our work is to create sustainability and to create balance in the natural world. So if I look at one of the big mines and the big tailings pond spills, our work is not necessarily to blame, right? Our work is not to find them. Our work is to help them, and also to take on our responsibilities to make something right. That the natural world is everyone's responsibility. So that's how we think about it. So this is my homeland. So we can look at Syilx law. We look at the Canadian statutes, right? We can look at Section 35 of the Constitution, and it basically, the Section 35 says that Indigenous people's rights are hereby recognized and affirmed, but it does not say what those rights are. And the reason it doesn't is because Canada has a separate government, and we have a government that is outside of Canada's constitution, that entails our laws, that entails all of our policies, our processes, and our procedures that are embedded in oral societies. And so the difference between the two is Canada has a statute. It attempts to subvert us underneath Canadian law, but we are unique nations, and so it recognizes our rights and our title, but it can't define that. It would be like me going to your home and saying, I'm making rules for your house. You know, you'd say to me, get out of my house. You'd be like, what are you talking about? Get out, right? Throw me out of the house. So that's the same thing between the difference between Canadian law and Indigenous law, is that we understand our title and our rights and where they came from. Just like Canada and the settler populations have said, oh, manifest destiny, it's our right given by God to come and settle this wild land where that's devoid of humans, right? So we each have our directive that came down from our highest authority, which I guess in the Constitution is maybe the church, the Queen, and then maybe the church prior to that. So, but Section 35 only recognizes Indigenous rights and title. It doesn't define it. And the reason it doesn't define it is because it can't. Only we can define our own rights and our own title. And we have done that pretty clearly. Section 9124 basically just says that the federal government is responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And then Section 92 basically says what the province is allowed to look at and make rules about. And so that's what puts us into conflict, in that the Canadian government and the province attempt to subvert us underneath the Canadian legal system as Canadian citizens. We're not. We have rights, we have autonomy, we have title still of our own lands because it was never treated. There was never war. In fact, the Okanogans threatened war early in the century, and the provincial government sort of backed up and said, no, we don't want to go to war. So our title in this province is still unchallenged. We have title, and so our work really has been to attempt to work with a foreign government to say, to we have no need to quantify our law or to even write it down, because our people understand it in the way that they live. The only reason that we would codify it is to bring it into harmony with Canadian federal provincial statutes. And so that's the work that we've been doing over the last number of years. I know that I'm sort of over time, so I have to apologize. I'm going to just kind of go past this because it basically just speaks to that parallel. So I've talked about this already. So going through, those are only 3 stories or 4, and we have thousands that we tell our people and that they internalize in their genetic coding, in their historic memory, and they bring it forward. And I have 7 grandchildren, and I speak to those stories to them so that they understand what those are. So the question, I guess, for the small group breakout is this. One of 2, you can answer them, is that what do you see as the differences or similarities in the 2 sort of legal perspectives? And what opportunities come from a collaborative approach in moving forward in Canada related to environment and protection and restoration? So I'll turn it over to Nadine and Candace.
Great, thank you so much, Loren. Thank you for all that stories and thoughts and insights. And now we'll put folks into small group breakout rooms. You'll be 3 or 4 people. If you want to take a moment to write this question down, I'll also broadcast it, but I know it doesn't stay up for very long. So I want to write that down. What are some of the similarities and differences of the legal perspectives, and what opportunities come from a collaborative approach? So we're going to have about 10 minutes or so in the breakout room. I'll give you a 30-second warning. If you have some trouble, you can come back to the main room and I can reassign you, but hopefully it all works out. So have a great conversation. It's okay. Hey, quiet. Welcome back, everybody.
Hello.
I hope that worked well for people. And yeah, we had to think about 5 minutes or so to do, if there was a little bit of any questions people wanted to ask in plenary. You can also use the chat, but we'll give 5 minutes for that and then move on into the next sort of part of the workshop. Is Loren back? Don't actually see her.
Oh, I can see you, and I'm not sure.
Oh, I can see you. There you are.
So the idea here is if folks have a question for Loren at this point, or something they would like to bring up. Okay, we've got a question in the chat. And then Loren will sort of give a few closing comments and we'll move into the second section. So we have a question here that says, what Loren considers to be the similarities between the legal perspectives.
I guess the similarities that I see is that when I look at, I don't have a background in law, but I had a sister who was a lawyer. And so I see, what I see is it attempts to pull down from this highest place, this highest authority, whether that, you know, is the crown, but then even before that, right, the Bible or the moral ethical codes. I see that it originates there in that idea of right living. I think what falls a little bit short is the idea of is the relationship, right? When we look at the relationship and how we see ourselves in relationship to the natural world, really impacts how we do business on the land and how we do things. So the similarity is that it attempts to pull from the highest order of creation, which is God, or which is in our word, Kunshuten, or for moral directive. So I see that. I see humans that they understand the importance of that. Then I see breakdown, right? So I see the judiciary as being a progressive sense of judiciary. Ours is not necessarily based on, it's not punitive. It's basically taking on our responsibility to remind people of where the road they're going down. And the repercussion of that. It's different than colonial law, I guess, in that way, but it has that progressive idea. I think it has these wise people, right? It has the wisdom. We have the wisdom of our chiefs, and our good men and good women are ones who have lived in this upstanding moral way. And I look at judges, right? So when we look at the Canadian system, provincial systems, that attempts to do that, it becomes partisan, but you know, that's kind of those are the similarities that I see.
And we have time for one or two more questions. Does somebody else want to ask a question of Luann? Here we have from Marcy. Does interpretation of story change over time? The way that our interpretation of world history is reinterpreted over time to address past biases or blind spots? Great question.
I think, you know, I always look at the story systems. And so a baby looks at a story and looks at the story and, you know, is really grateful to all of the tribes, and they go and they do the ceremony. The people who are scholars or have more world experience look at them and they say, well, what are the theoretical constructs that are there? And so how does that inform us? And so I don't know that theoretical constructs, just like in science, I guess, truth is truth, right? So the idea of balance and sustainability and collaboration and helping one another, those are some really simple ethical principles. So do they change? I don't think so. It's not unlike, I guess, a Bible, in that the principles and the directives and the idea of morality, moral codes exist in that system. So I guess that as the world changes, so historically we would have heard them and we would have had interpretations, and as the world changes and becomes more complex, we can still look to them, and I think they can still do the same things. They still have the same capability. And I guess for me, that's how I think about how ingenious they are, right? I look at and I interpret stories and stories. It's a new kind of a field or an area where we're looking at them and asking them questions, the stories. And we think about them as this gracious informing us, this sense of them passing that on so that we could continue to be. And so that I have that sense of gratitude for that. They're moral ethical codes, but they're processes, they're procedures, they're principles, they're actually standards of conduct too. So I don't know that they change. They're still the same as they ever were, but we have to apply them to more complex ideas in terms of things like water quality standards, or restoration practice and things. So I don't think that they change, because I think truth and principles and rightness stay the same through history.
Thank you, Loren. We're going to move into the second part, but do you have just a closing comments or anything you'd like to say?
Only that, we are attempting to, or we are working to incorporate it in our negotiations with the federal and provincial governments through the negotiations for the Okanagan-Smelkameen Grassland Park Reserve. And so we're incorporating that law, and we're pulling those stories in. And in our previous discussion in my small group, we were talking about tech, traditional ecological knowledge. And so knowledge of the ecology of an area is most suited to the people who've lived there for intergenerationally. So we're working to not just establish the law, the principles, the practices that come out of our story systems that are based on our historic knowledge of this place. So it's a really exciting time for us in that both the federal and provincial governments are really open to how do we incorporate these different ways of thinking and knowing. And so it's a really great, in a sense, it's a case study in moving forward. And because we all have the same agenda around the protection and restoration of land and water and those things. And we know moving forward that that's going to be the most important thing for life on this planet. So it's exciting. It will be exciting to see how that works forward. And just wanted to thank everyone for being here today.
Well, thank you again. It's been really wonderful. And I believe there is a website people can check out the project you were just talking about, South Okanagan Grasslands.
Yeah, so the general population, I believe there is a website. If you just look under South Okanagan-Smelkameen Grassland Park, you should be able to find it. I don't have the website because we don't deal with that. We deal with the Indigenous people and our thinking on it. So, but I'll make sure I get that to you.
So thank you again. This has been really wonderful, and I'm really sitting with Harry Robinson and the advice to really think about it, and really let the stories seep in, and so very, very, very beautiful. So thank you again so much. I'll be watching this more than once, I'm sure. So we do want to have a few minutes just to, because this has been a series, and we wanted to reflect back a little bit to the participants, how it's been going. So we have had 152 unique participants over time. And just a little bit of breakdown is that 29% have been provincial staff from the province of BC, 27% from environmental and social nonprofits, 12% from Indigenous communities and organizations, 10% from academia, 9% local and regional governments, 6% from adventure tourism businesses, 3% from the forestry sector, and a few feds. That's kind of how it's gone. And we've got really, really great feedback. People have really appreciated a lot of aspects of, and I was going to sort of tell you a little bit more about that, but I feel like generally there's a sense of optimism and hope. And a couple of key themes are that people are looking for examples to follow and ways to apply learning, and taking all the teachings that we've been given and thinking about what this means for them in their own domains. And I would also say one of the key things that we've really heard a lot is that people want to talk about it. People want more dialogue. People are really open to more learning, and they're also open to more dialogue. So what we'd love to do now is maybe go into about a 10-minute breakout group where we want to hear from you just individually as to what you would be interested in participating next. And one idea that we do have is something that's more that's got a longer time for dialogue itself, because people really love the breakouts. But then we can also be bringing in more resource people. We do have more resources. We are able to continue with the second phase of the series. So, and we will send you another, written feedback survey as well. But this is just another way for us to share amongst ourselves a little bit. And so if you can go ahead and send us out again, Nadine, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. say. How many times in Zoom land have people said to you, "You're muted"? It's like, ah, yes, my lips are moving and you can't hear what I'm saying. Thank you so much. We had a great discussion in our breakout groups, and I'm sure lots of you or all of you did. So again, we hate to keep giving you written surveys, but we will. And then we also thought that we would try today, if everybody would just take a minute now to just throw a few words in the chat box about what happened, some of the sort of top line messages from your breakout or something that's on your mind. And I will say that one of the things, and I told the folks in my breakout room this, we really hear loud and clear that people want dialogue and want to really think through how this applies to them. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is maybe before the end of the year, holding a slightly longer session that's very dialogue based, without a presentation, but structured around digging into some of the dialogic pieces. And then in the new year, potentially starting again with another series that would be presentation based as well as dialogue based. So, you know, we're learning as we go. I mean, we're learning the content as well as we're learning about process and about this community and what this community really wants and needs. And just so grateful for all the good mind and all the good heart that everybody's bringing. So yeah, please do take a minute just now to write in the chat box, and I'll be quiet unless somebody wants to ask something else of Nadine or I at this point, while you guys are chatting away. Any question? That you would have to say it because people are typing in the chat box. Okay, well, we'll just give you a minute to carry on with that. See some great ideas coming forward. We do have resources to continue. So we will definitely be continuing in the new year. So that's great. Thank you to the Vancouver Foundation. Oh, my goodness, that's the first time I've thanked the Vancouver Foundation. That's terrible. Don't tell them. Tell them I was super grateful and we thank them every single time. Oh my goodness, that's terrible. But they did. I should say this whole series has been funded by the Vancouver Foundation through their systems change stream of funding. So we're very grateful to them. Okay, so if we're not going to kick you out if you're still chatting, that's wonderful. But we're going to close the session. Nadine, any last comments?
I just really wanted to thank everyone for participating, especially those who were able to make it to all 3 sessions. And thank you for your understanding with our tech issue last time and rescheduling to today. I know it was actually helpful for some people, so there you go. I will send an email to everyone again with a follow-up survey. We've had pretty good response, but it'd be really great for this 3rd time if you haven't yet, and if you have provided your feedback. It'll be both on this session, but also, as Candice mentioned, to help give us some direction in how Y2Y can help continue to support these conversations, to bring other presenters to you, any tricky questions that you have that we can sort of play a role in convening. So please do take that survey and just let us know some of your thoughts. It usually only takes like 3 to 5 minutes. Or if you just want to email me directly back in the body of an email, that's great too. If you have ideas or needs and where you think we could help organize and facilitate more learning on this. So yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for all these comments in the chat. I'll be able to save this chat, so we'll be able to work through it. And I see some people have some questions embedded in there. So thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Just one last comment. We are working on a resources page for our website as well. So when Nadine sends out the survey link, we'll also send you a link to that. And that'll be, by necessity, that'll be a kind of a living document, but we are putting that together too for you. So have a beautiful day in the sunshine. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
You can stay on if you want, Loren, for a minute.